Actually, webinars are always a little bit of funny one because you see here 3 people on the screen. Maybe I start here a little bit slowly. So Pablo, our guest for today, Pablo Larios, Micaela Dixon. Pablo is in Berlin at the moment, and we had a mini chat before, and he also will talk a little bit about Berlin. Micaela Dixon, who's in the middle of my screen here, it's Vogel Island Arts Project Coordinator. Is that the right title? Program. Sorry. So it's only about titles, and I am Nicolaus Schafhausen, the strategic director of Vogel Island Arts already for a long time, about 12 years, and I'm at home in Brussels. Can I continue? Micaela?
Yeah, I think it's a good time.
Okay, before Pablo starts, I welcome all of you. I forgot how many talks we have done already. Micaela, you will dive into it after my mini introduction here. When we read Pablo's trilogy for Moose magazine, I thought, wow. So this is worth reading again and again and again, and I did so today again after a while. It's about everything. It's about art, it's about money, and that was probably also for me for us the point of departure inviting you, Pablo. It has a lot to do with our work. It has interesting parallels with our work on Vogel Island. Vogel Island is an island, the province of Newfoundland, Labrador, Canada. For me, it was obvious, as I'm from Berlin, that you're arguing from an urban perspective. And when I read, there were so many arguments, so many lines, which impressed me a lot. But there was one little thing you said, or you wrote, and I forgot in which part of your trilogy, we have to look at nature and its use and land, at how land becomes form and material, and how the past is negotiated at the fringes. This is so central for me and so complicated to answer. You stressed the wording decentralization a lot. I'm wondering if you can dive into it a bit. But maybe the most important for me, I wonder what you think that a small island, and you have never visited Vogel Island, or if a small island can be a proxy for a big or for a small planet. Yeah, welcome all. Welcome, Pablo, Micaela.
All right. Hi, everyone again, and welcome. So this is our newest digital talk in our Lost and Found Agency series. And this talk is titled The Great Decentering, Topographies of the Rural, a talk by Pablo Larios, which will be moderated by Nicolaus and myself. So for those of you unfamiliar with our digital talk series, hosted monthly, our Lost and Found Agency is an online public conversation and a lecture series that features artists, professionals, researchers from a variety of disciplines. Events range from formal lectures to informal participatory conversations that encourage exchange in a peer-to-peer learning environment. Our Lost and Found Agency thematic engages key thinkers and makers and addresses themes pertaining to decolonization, the climate crisis, alternate economies, reciprocity, new forms of democracy and democratic engagement, migration, and consensus building in the age of fake news, among other topics of the participants' choosing. So today's talk with Pablo Larios will examine how the post-pandemic era has witnessed a significant challenge to dominant forms of economic and cultural globalization. Trade wars and real wars are redrawing the map of an artistic terrain once defined by globalism and free movement. In The Great Decentering, Pablo Larios argues that the space of this transformation can be seen not in cities, but in rural or extra-urban spaces where the lines of the past are being negotiated and contested. So now I will pass the torch on to you, Pablo.
Thank you, Micaela, and thank you, Nicolaus, and thanks to Fogo Island for the invitation to speak on these topics. My name is Pablo Larios. I'm a writer and art critic, and for about the past decade, I've written about contemporary art and artists, and mainly for magazines. I've reviewed art exhibitions, done interviews, and profiled artists, mainly in Europe and especially in Berlin, where I live. What follows today is not art criticism, but an analysis based on close looking, an argument based on observing art and artists, and from that, developing thoughts on how the artistic landscape is changing. By artistic landscape, I refer not only to artworks, but to the interplay of art spaces, urban spaces, extra-urban spaces, art galleries, museums, studios, media, and the lives and works of practicing artists. My recent articles begin with the observation that a number of artists have been leaving cities. There is the obvious situation that many cities have become too expensive for many people to live in. But it's not just artists being pushed out economically. Many other artists want to build new things, for instance, new institutions entirely. What does this mean for art, traditionally made and shown in urban centers, and traditionally beholden to institutions with accrued cultural capital, usually in cities? As I explored these questions, I started to think about what cities are and what they can do and what they no longer provide. During the pandemic, I began to think about extra-urban sites, suburbs, farms, countrysides, as places that are emblematic for many of the processes at work in the world today. For instance, processes of decentering, deglobalization that have emerged as economic and cultural forces. And before I go there, I actually want to tell the story of how I got there. It was one of those strange accidents to which we in retrospect owe so much. Just over 10 years ago, I found myself lost in a small German city. I had the year before moved to Germany. I knew very little about contemporary art. I was a student of comparative literature, and I had just gotten a fellowship to come to Germany for a year. Comparative literature is a study in establishing differences and similarities between art forms, between literary histories. Comparison always made sense to me as someone who was always in between cultures. I was born in Honduras, but grew up in the US. The field has its origins in something called philology, or the historical study of languages. But comparative literature emerged in the 20th century is a way of looking at literature away from a national-oriented approach to studying literature. Now, in Germany, I was unsure whether I would go down an academic path or do something else. Part of what prevented me from entering academia was the sense that in the field of comparative literature, there hadn't really been any important innovations in about 2 decades, since around the time of post-colonial studies. The field still fascinated me, but it seemed kind of dormant. There were important innovations in the humanities, but I saw them elsewhere, especially, for instance, in the history of science. But I was not a historian of science, I was a literature student. What was important to me was to surround myself with people who I felt were sort of pushing things and innovating. But first I needed to find them. Back in the US, art never really appealed to me as a field of study. I loved looking at art, but I didn't experience art as something alive. In the same way that you can love and study Latin while knowing that Latin is actually a dead language, mostly. There was something I knew called contemporary art, but what I knew of the art that was made in our own time struck me often as a bit silly and left me cold. In the US, I would go to galleries and museums and try to understand and be educated, but too often whatever I saw left me with the feeling that many of us might be familiar with. This isn't for me. More accurately, I don't know enough to experience this the way I'm supposed to experience it. Like I was missing something. Part of this was because I didn't grow up going to contemporary art museums. I didn't live in places where museums or galleries existed, certainly not contemporary museums. When I encountered contemporary art, there was always some history I didn't understand, something external to the work that had to be explained, like a story that had to be told for you to actually unlock what you were seeing. Yet the story was usually not really a part of the work. It was something that you had to read about later, or in a wall text, or something to be explained to you. I want to pause on this experience because of the enormous divide that exists between people for whom contemporary art is an important category of cultural expression, and people for whom this category is something challenging or even intimidating. In my own experience, it was as if my sense observation was never enough. There was always some halo or myth that surrounded what I was seeing. For instance, in order to understand this, you must know about what was going on in New York in the 80s, or did you not know who so-and-so was? There was another story about an artist who made work about not doing anything at all. That's what the work was about. But how to actually get that story? I would read art theory sometimes, but it all seemed, to be honest, a little bit kind of made up to me at the time. So I was on the other side of the divide that I'm mentioning. But through my study of literature, I knew a few things. One is that art usually is something that is a function of intense communities of activity. I also knew that in order to understand something, you often need to look very closely at it in order to understand your own ideas, your own thoughts about it. Art happened through tight-knit networks of people who could understand micro differences. In the poets of the New York school, for instance, Frank O'Hara or John Ashbery, wrote in proximity to painters like Helen Frankenthaler or Jackson Pollock. Could there be something similar in our own day? I didn't really think so. In the US at the time, during the Obama years, the time after the financial recession, there was a kind of cynicism that I felt had descended on people my age. In spite of the Great Recession, the banks had been bailed out and the economy bounced back like never before. It was a new consumerist era, one in which mega corporations grew in power. The Obama years had seen the flourishing of the tech industry. This was a long way away from the antitrust legislation that had threatened to consolidate Microsoft, for instance, in the 1990s. The emergence of Facebook and iPhones, of social media, of Amazon, and the promise of something like the Arab Spring, for instance, combined into something that was all a bit cautiously optimistic. These swept into a new aspirational tendency of these post-bailout years. There was the important exception of the Occupy movement, which really critiqued this new Gilded Age. But generally, to live in cities meant to assimilate, it meant assimilating oneself into an entrepreneurial mindset. Words like prosumer or professional consumer, producer consumer were discussed positively. Curating became something that one did to rooms or food. We began to see media spheres liberalized as Twitter and social media decentralized the conversation. Legacy media in that time was losing subscribers. But I want to get back to this day in which I kind of found myself lost in Germany. And before I do that, I want to describe this moment a little bit. In some way, this set of conditions I'm describing did lead me to contemporary art, because it wasn't exactly true that I didn't appreciate contemporary art at all. I did find it, but it wasn't in galleries. It was on the internet, on Facebook, through digital images shared on social networks. There was a movement around this time was later called post-internet art. And I met artists in New York and Berlin who wanted to portray this strange, highly corporatized present, one in which, for instance, the human body seemed to have smelted with the mega corporation. What I noticed was that there was an affinity between what artists in this that I had observed were doing and a similar approach taken by early pop artists, people in the post-war era who wanted to either critique or celebrate consumer culture. My first published essay came out of this observation. It was called Pure Products Go Crazy, after a poem by William Carlos Williams that begins, "The pure products of America go crazy." I was observing something specific, and I wanted to figure it out. Artists were using commodities as ready-mades, but in a way that captured the sense that we were all now carrying around smart devices, Fitbits, surveillance machines. And what was interesting and strange about it was that everyone seemed to want this, because on the surface, it seemed to mean that things were being shaken up. Information was being liberalized. It had been given back to everyone else, to the people. It was around this time that I experienced something formative. I owe this to an accident. The accident was that I had wound up not in, but outside the city of Kassel. The tram stopped. The conductor let me out. I had actually fallen asleep on the tram. It was a Sunday morning and the tram wouldn't be going back to the city. I didn't have any cash on me or know how to get back in there. So I walked. I must have walked 2 or 3 hours to get back into the city. I had wanted to go to the art exhibition Documenta because it was said to be the most important major art exhibition. I didn't really know that much about it, but I wanted to go see it. And then I'd end up lost outside of Kassel. As I walked, I observed the countryside outside the city. It was mostly flat with some rolling green hills on the horizon. There were industrial hangars, a kind of high-tech farmland. I remember a closed gas station. I had just moved to Berlin, but this was something else. This was a kind of semi-rural German heartland. What I saw didn't depress me, but impressed onto me something that I would come to appreciate. It wasn't a leap for me to see almost immediately why this terrain would need a concept of culture that was not historical, but contemporary. There was a kind of flatness to the territory, a dimensionlessness that made you want to appreciate the new. I genuinely and intuitively kind of got why, in the absence of Hollywood or top 40 music or high fashion, this terrain would somehow need a concept of contemporary art. Something like a sublimation of a need for culture into the contemporary. When I learned later about the history of Documenta, I realized that this intuition was actually very much in line with the early mission of that show. Let me give you a sense of what I mean. 5 years later, I would write a review of Documenta in 2017, and there I described the following. I quote, "The curators have devised a show along the lines of economy, restitution and politics, repatriation and commerce, material and visual cultures, and historical relationships between Germany and Greece, the global North and South. It's an intense, ambitious effort spanning centuries and including several hundred works, which attempts to provide no less than an artistic, intellectual reparation for culture's imbrication and political and economic damage throughout history." Bear with me. In many ways, the curator's assessment that culture, here meant broadly as cultural and personal maturation, in the German sense of Bildung, is couched in destruction and oppression is correct. In 1955, Arnold Bode deliberately chose the West German city of Kassel as a host for Documenta because of its close proximity to the border with East Germany. His interest was in using contemporary art as a tool or a decoy to deter German culture from future nationalistic tendencies, as was expected in the wake of the Second World War. Kassel was steeped in war. Shrapnel shards still littered the fields outside the Friedrichshain as the show opened. The city's broad avenues were made so that tanks could easily cross it, and munitions factories and tank production plants had long surrounded the city. End quote. This is what I couldn't have known at the time, that this art exhibition was also a comment on a history of destruction and militarism. Almost like a ghost, this was an atmosphere I perceived walking in the countryside on the margins of the city. In post-war Germany, history had been obliterated. Now it was the task to write that history. To write this history of culture was to call on artists who live today. And with that came an opportunity to consider the culture of the present and not the culture of the past. This is what contemporary art had to mean in this place. The story to me seemed very different from the story of contemporary art as it was told to me when I was in the US by art historians sitting in galleries or in schools in New York. Recently, a lot of curatorial and historical work has challenged this optimistic reading of the early documentas. For instance, it has been shown that some of the administrators of those early shows had Nazi ties, which they'd covered up. And the art historians tell us how the idea of documenta fit into plans for post-war American hegemony. After the Marshall Plan, West Germany was reconstructed on American terms in such a way as to pave the road for the ascendance of the US as a global superpower. The CIA used abstract art as a deterrent against the communist threat. It's easy to see how documenta fits into this story. I'm not dismissing these important historical findings, but my own experience of documenta in 2012 was very formative for me. It showed me that art history was still being written and that artists had a lot to say about our time. And it took me on some level also to the countryside. Walking through that documenta, I saw, for instance, how the very things I was experiencing, the same anxieties, the same innovations were regenerated artistically. The idea of animism, the old notion that objects have agency, had taken root in the lived experience of the internet, in which information and images traveled, morphed, accelerated, almost as if they had their own wills. And what I saw in that exhibition, to name one example, was a set of artists who were expressing and articulating these anxieties, these concerns, even through simple media, such as a beehive or a garden, which pulsed animistically. I took the train back from Kassel to Berlin, and I decided to give up my studies in literature. And I decided basically then and there to devote myself to contemporary art. I felt I had found my calling. I wanted to be an art critic. The epiphany that I had outside of Kassel was as follows. In this place, which had been basically razed to the ground, contemporary art was needed almost as a replacement for a culture that had been out of necessity lost or destroyed. The idea that contemporary art was a replacement, basically a ghost limb for a spoiled cultural history, was liberating because it actually enabled us to shape that history. Art was something that didn't exist only in the past, but really existed in the present. And the people shaping it were not only artists, but curators, gallerists, critics, viewers, students, who all engaged in this thing called contemporary art. This was all why, when a year later I saw the artist John Kelsey's watercolor portraits of data centers in New Jersey, I was immediately drawn to them. These were blank buildings located not in Manhattan, but across the river in Mahwah, New Jersey. In many ways, high-frequency trading encapsulated the automation and strange zombification of our new era of finance. But what interested me is that the image of this, the icon of it, was not Wall Street. It was actually something on the frontier. It was something happening in an extra-urban environment. This is what Kelsey's watercolor series really, I felt, summed up in such a evocative way, that in order to understand our present, we often had to look at the margins. We often had to look at in rural sites or extra urban sites, for instance, across the river in Mahwah, New Jersey. In a review of John Kelsey's exhibition, I quoted an essay by the art historian David Joselet. Joselet had been writing about the effects of digital image circulation on the work of art. I quote, "How does a painting belong to a network?" asked David Joselet in a 2009 essay published in October. In his expressive, idyllic scenes of deceptively quiet data centers, Kelsey literalizes Joselet's question. These paintings seem to answer, a painting cannot, in fact, belong to a network because that network itself of ex-friends, false Facebook friends, spammers, implies its opposite, falling out, alienation, distance, breakup, deception, unfriending. A few years later, I published my first results of the kind of research I began on art and artists. My first project had been to articulate a neo-pop tendency in contemporary art. But just before the time that Trump happened, I started to see how artists were doing something else. They were building alliances with one another and making work that often seemed deliberately opaque, even hermetic. In contrast to the kind of mantra of connection and connectivity that marked those years, they were now establishing networks of solidarity that were deliberately exclusive to others. To experience this art, it wasn't enough to see a JPEG. You would have to be there in person. And maybe if you were there, you couldn't even see it either because it had disappeared. I started noticing how artists became fed up with what I had described as this entrepreneurial mentality, having their own websites, documenting their works and sharing them on Facebook. After a half decade of being fixated with life lived on screens, artists began to work on site in person. Craft became interested again. It was as if I was noticing something that just a few years ago had seemed very foreign, the old idea that artists should resist the dominant culture. And this meant building up new alliances and giving up old ones, creating new subcultures. The result of this research was 2 essays about what I termed network fatigue. Digital networks, the ease of circulating digital imagery was doing something strange to the work of art. It had dematerialized it. And as a way of resisting this, suddenly the pendulum was swinging the other way. Artists now wanted to do something else. They wanted to work with lo-fi media. They wanted to restrict circulation. In a way, they were becoming more local and less globally interested. I knew that this argument would be controversial. I was arguing for an art that was temporary, provisional, on-site, lo-fi, and based on communal or communitarian interests, based on, for instance, the idea of friendship. I had been thinking about the old idea of artistic schools. But what about taking back this concept of working with real friends, not just the idea of kind of corporatized friendship in the social media era? I knew that the argument would be controversial. After all, I was saying that artists should give up trying to talk to many people, and they should just pay attention to the people around them and start from there. After years of trying to be global, it was now time to be local. After I published my essay called Network Fatigue, there was an exhibition in Nottingham put on by 2 artist activists. The show was called The Leaf of Pablo, and it was a bit of a jab at my argument. They pointed out, I think correctly, that the argument, working with your friends, as they described it, having solidarity with people around you, was something that people of color had always done. I mention this because I think they were right. The idea of for us, by us, FUBU, was an important counter-tradition in art, especially as done by Black and brown people, people who were barred access to the mainstream, even as the mainstream capitalized on what they did. So before I kind of get to the subject of this talk, which is supposed to be about the rural, I want to summarize what led up to that, which is firstly an ironic espousal of the mainstream in basically the ascendant social media era, to later a kind of withdrawal into small groups of atomized and concentrated activity. In a way, this was a trajectory of networks breaking down. What I had called network fatigue developed rapidly into a series of effects, as artistic as they are political, a sense of increasingly fragmented conversations, political tribalism, the unprecedented growth of a new economic elite, somehow in concert with the rise of populist tendencies. It's well documented the role that mega corporations and social media have to play in all of this. This morning, I read in the Financial Times that, quote, populism isn't over. And the author said that the first wave populism was something like a performance art. And there's something odd and kind of remarkable about the number of TV performers and comedians that came into politics in this time. Something else was happening. Just years before, movements like the Arab Spring and Occupy had been important democratic waves that sought to decentralize power. But what actually happened? Instead of political agency becoming decentralized, Power had somehow accumulated to the very top. I think that social media became a kind of opiate, one that delivered a huge illusion of agency, all while real political and financial and corporate operators accumulated just more and more power. I continue to believe that art is not just a reflection of reality, but that contemporary art bears some relation to the power relations that exist in the world. When we feel outraged because someone has appropriated an image, for example, when we feel angered because a white person has capitalized on Black suffering by making use of imagery of Emmett Till, we're not just speaking about art, but about real suffering, about real people in the world and the injustices they face. Art becomes something like a lightning rod. We feel things when we see works of art because they remind us of things we experience in our own lives. Because our lives are always political, because we have to seek to correlate our own provisional experiences with the provisional experiences of the people around us, we then bring to art certain political intuitions. Even when we appreciate art that does not seem to contain politics, for instance, in decorative or abstract painting, we tie into an old political dream, that of a utopia in which reality can be depoliticized. Of course, much of the art we do see today is political, from the new history painting that heroizes lives to the forms of institutional critique that challenge how exhibitions are funded. I mention all of this now because I feel it's important to remind us that there is a link between art and the way we experience it and the political experiences of our time. This is an important assumption to my argument. A few years later, the coronavirus pandemic did something odd to daily life. In fact, it wasn't only a state of exception, it actually showed a lot of the mechanisms that were already in process. Take, for instance, the idea of deglobalization. This has recently become another buzzword. The idea that a golden age of globalization and free movement of goods has come to an end, accelerated first by the pandemic, then by the inflation that has come out of the combined effects of the energy crisis caused by the war in Ukraine. However, the idea of deglobalization was already being discussed by economics well before the pandemic. For instance, in relation to the growth of Xi's China and an attempted reshoring of production, for instance, in China, also other places. So this is all kind of a preamble to the focus of my articles, which is cities, but also ways in which history and artistic history is being renegotiated. And what I began to find is that in order to find images for all of this and create stories around it, create narratives, one had to kind of step outside cities. I became convinced that an observation of urban topographies, right, or an observation of art as seen by, for instance, simply looking at galleries as they exist in a city like Berlin, where I live, or London, or New York, we weren't really getting the full picture of something there. And in my articles, I tried to account for this and describe why that was the case. But I kind of started from something quite simple, which is just the idea that a lot of artists I was talking to were also leaving cities. And, I quote now the artist Seth Price, who said, "I took a year's hiatus from the art world, trying to figure some things out. I shut down the studio, stopped making saleable works, said no to shows. I didn't stop working though." To continue, I can only explain it in terms of a discomfort with the way artists are conditioned to seek visibility, not only for their work, but for their persona. The contemporary mandate is to know everyone and be known to all. I'm really interested in this critique of visibility as Price describes it. We kind of have an intuition that visibility is not only an artistic notion, but also a political one. And I think what Price was noticing is that somehow the idea of visibility is, it's almost like economically it's lost lost its currency. It's the visibility is somehow devalued. And this is another form of marginalization that I wanted to also account for in my essays, which is this notion that simply becoming visible isn't quite enough anymore. And this is all just kind of the kind of preamble for what I was observing in this series of articles about decentering and about the rural. I had kind of planned to read a selection of this article, but in the interest of time, I might suggest, Nicolaus, if you have any questions, we could maybe pause and go to questions, or yeah, how would you suggest? Or should I read some?
I think you should go on, read some, and when we go, this is open to all. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. Micaela will read them, and please note if we should read your name as well or not. I think you should continue for a bit, for let's say 5-6 minutes, and then
okay.
Micaela, maybe we have questions. So
okay.
I know
okay.
Micaela is very keen to ask. So
okay, great. Okay, I'll continue. As you mentioned, Nicolaus, yeah, the argument in my essay is there's a lot of strands to it, so it's not one that really lends itself to summary. But I've tried to summarize a few of the points, and I'll go on. From my window in Berlin, the city looks more or less the way it did before the pandemic. On Sunday, the shops are closed. Few people are on the streets. Bars are sleepy and darkened. Even prior to the social distancing era, the city was slowing down. The look of gentrification had actually eased, despite factorially increasing rents. Artist friends from Lisbon, Oslo, or Shanghai went back to Portugal, Norway, China. The city felt more fractured and less international, and the conversation did too. Whereas just a few nights ago, a night out at Berlin Gallery meant 100 people speaking expat English, packed into a well-lit Belle Etage art space, that's not the place I recognize today. The openings are smaller, the conversation splintered. It's rare that I catch what I'm terming the conversation, and it isn't because of the language we speak or the size of the space. I wonder, where's the pulse of things today? I see two mutually exclusive narratives to account for this decentering. The first theory is that the herd has simply moved on to another cheaper place. But a second theory is as follows. The formula of visibility and economic access that allowed for cities to be metonymies for connectivity and artistic externalization has been decoupled. In other words, increasingly, I think that the conversation isn't happening in or even about cities, at least not with the concentration that I experienced before. In the 2000s, the pulse feels to me subterranean, more of a subtle tremor, decentralized. Just as content becomes algorithmically generated and experienced, and culture becomes microcultural, these tremors become smaller, more individualized, radial, and thus experienced less as a collective. It's a conversation with one. The space of the conversation is now domestic. It's drug marijuana rather than speed or ecstasy. It's activity something like cooking rather than flaneuring across capital cities. Consider the astonishing echo in 2021 of John Maynard Keynes' widely cited 1919 statement that previous to World War I, the inhabitant of London could order by telephone, sipping his morning tea in bed, the various products of the whole earth in such quantity as he might see fit, and reasonably expect their early delivery upon his doorstep. World War I put a cork on economic globalization, coinciding with a pandemic comparable to ours in scope and duration. Today, it's shortages, soaring gas prices, trade wars, and once again, a new real war in Europe. This isn't to say that there's no exchange of culture today, or that cities do not provide a relatively even measure of concentrated activity, but rather that the currents run rather in the tributaries below and around, not in any mainstream. An extra-urban precariat, as nomadic as pollen, feels permanently locked out of the upward salaried world of middle management and career progress. Amid the death of retail, cities become sites of a new feudalism of inheritance, tourism, and investment. Culturally, the operant metaphor shifts outward from the repurposed industrial site to the garden, the field, the terrain. The rave happens outdoors. I think that's it.
Well, wonderful. Thank you, Pablo. It's it had a very melancholic undertone. It's yeah, I experienced probably the same. So I had to think about, this has nothing to do directly with your lecture. For someone like me who was director of public institutions or semi-public institutions for 25 years, and as you know, 25 years ago from now, or a little bit longer, and there were not a lot of visitors at that time. So I saw the peak and falling it down again. So now what I experienced in post-COVID, or it's people don't talk to each other anymore at openings. Yeah. So that is we just had for Fogo Island a big event on the island, the so-called Fogo Island Arts Week. It's everywhere the same. How do we reach out to in the urban context or in the rural context to the in the city, to the cities, to the population, yeah, and that's the same also at Fogo Island as an example in the rural context. Is that what we do? Yeah. What does it has to do with me, and what does it has to do with the people? Yeah. I have always questioned this to myself, but now it's even more urgent. What do we do, and for whom? I know it's going into a little bit another direction, but it's that I'm also taking away from your presentation, Micaela.
I have a question for you. We spoke about it briefly before, but I was curious I asked you about the reception of the article, because I think to some extent, the word I was looking for earlier, but I'd forgotten, was, I think you make some really interesting and also really maybe like semi-controversial points. I say semi because I don't think it's like outwardly, you know, like it's not going to cause rage, but I think it's, you know, even your comments about, I think, cities, condos, the institution, curating as well. It's a skeptical take on maybe possibility. And something that struck me, I think, as well, is the way you talk about having not seen work of art, like any artwork that has moved you, which I thought was really interesting, because I think it takes from this maybe really like primal reaction to any kind of artwork or anything creative, is that capacity to instill feeling, like, or also known as like affect, for example. That's a bit of a tangent to unpack, but
yeah, how to begin? I'll say something that maybe speaks to both of your comments a little bit, questions. I had a very interesting meeting with the sociologists Luc Boltanski and Arnaud Esquer a couple of years ago. And they're living in Paris. And Paris, in a way, it's all of what we've been talking about has been accelerated in a place like Paris. Really, you know, the luxury industry has a really strong hold over the city. And I asked them about the countryside. I write about this in the essay, but I'll kind of unpack it a bit. And they told me a story which really I found just incredible, which is that in the deindustrializing moment in the 1960s in France, there was a similar kind of repopulation of the countryside. You know, people moved to the south of France and lived on vineyards and started communes and all that. And the story is really interesting. So what happened is that after this movement, really big economic interests, the predecessors to today's LVMH or Kering, they began to capitalize on what had happened culturally, and they started to realize that one could take, say, a vineyard and turn it into a luxury hotel, or turn it into a turn the wine there into to a high-priced wine. So they really spoke, they really analyzed all this, and they said, there are these wines that were just sort of like table wine, and all of a sudden overnight they became luxury products. And when I heard this, I thought, oh, this is incredible. This is basically what's been going on today again. And they have a very, let's say, also quite a thorny argument around all of this, which is that a lot of this depends on narratives and histories. And they said that in each of these cases, so they talk a lot about food, they talk about the tourism industry, but also craft. And they said that in each of these cases where there's been a really huge price differential between what was, let's say, originally the case and the way something can be marketed now, it depends so much on stories and the stories we tell. So they said to me, if you're going to sell a knife and say this is a high crafted artisanal knife, you're going to have to tell a story about it, and you're going to have to market it in such a way. And I don't know, this sort of unlocked something for me in the way I thought not only about our world and what's going on, but also about contemporary art a little bit. And this is maybe the next project, but I want to explore how a lot of what we see in contemporary art is dependent on narratives we built around it. I'm a journalist. I produce these narratives, but it's so important. Contemporary art is developed in such a way that the stories we tell about it are actually just as important as or almost as important, perhaps, as the actual production. And this in some way lines up with the argument that I've just described, in which in order to value something or to evaluate something, you need to tell a story about it. And anyway, this speaks a little bit to what I describe in the essay, which is that I would see a lot of exhibitions, and I would think, this is an interesting artist, but it seems a little bit overblown what I'm reading about it, or there's some discrepancy in terms of what I'm actually seeing and what I'm sort of reading about it. And I can't say why that's the case, but I guess I'm just pointing to some similar processes of like luxurification at play. With regard to the countryside, I don't see that it's inherently any better there, but I think it allows for a kind of small scale ethics to develop. If one is really I guess what I'm saying is that in cities, it's already a self-selecting public that visits and can visit art exhibitions. That's what I observe a little bit. And it is quite different if you're making things and come into contact with different demographics and are forced to account. You become accountable to them. And I'm curious, if that's the experience on Fogo Island, but
on Fogo Island, you cannot hide, you cannot run away. So if you do something with art, it's visible. In a city, in an urban context, not. You pass a museum or a gallery, but it has nothing to do with you. It's different in a rural area. I got a question from Zita Kopp. Zita Kopp is the founder of Schafhausen. She's on that call, and her question: are we trying to reconcile the physical and the imaginative? If physical life in the cities has been taken over by corporations, then maybe imaginative life is challenged. Is it that the rural makes imagination possible because physical life is possible?
It's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I mentioned briefly today this kind of return to craft, and over the past 5 years or so, there's been a kind of rehabilitation of a lot of the art of manually making things and craft, and the physicality of it does seem essential. And yeah, how can we kind of rehabilitate what's actually sort of physically in front of us? Yeah, I think that is a part of it. Can't really say why off the top of my head, but it does seem to me that there's a virtuality that one is on some level trying to undo. And we can live virtually even if we're not on Zoom or on screens. There's forms of what I consider algorithmically structured interactions that seem kind of a part of the contemporary. And I think maybe the challenge of finding ways out of that lie actually in the possibility of real friction, whether it's protest or whether it's having someone that has nothing in common with you challenge you about something. And I'm not advocating any violence or anything like that. I'm just saying that it's a bit like when you go home and your family asks you about your political beliefs, and you're stunned, or and you have to explain yourself to them. Maybe there's actually something really important in that, because I feel that in other parts of society we're kind of losing the possibility for these cross interactions, and that it's what the sociologists tell us, which is that we're really speaking to communities of the like-minded, and we see this very, very closely politically, right? And so I think there's there's a necessity to find ways to escape the bubble, right?
But we have a question in the Q&A, but before I have do you think that possibly the return to craft, or to this desire to experience materiality kind of quite closely, could also be maybe to a larger extent a response to possibly the future of precarity and future recessions, and the way that we're experiencing financial capitalism sort of completely change the possibility around aspects of our lives that maybe 20 or 30 years ago we didn't consider possible?
And just to understand the question a bit, and the intuition that this is tied to craft is because it's fragility, or?
No, I mean, I guess maybe I'm thinking a bit more especially as it relates to the culture or life here, quilts or something that were made with used clothes, to make sure that children, adults kept warm in the winter. There's a real kind of relationship to not just beauty or aesthetics, but making sure that you survive, right? And I was even thinking recently about people's return to darning, fixing clothes, not just throwing things out anymore. This kind of thinking about how, to an extent also, the climate crisis, et cetera, but there's a different relationship, I think, to finance now for a lot of us who are growing up realizing that we might face a recession. Do you know what I mean? Wages, inflation, et cetera. And to some extent, to me, these things feel like they have to be connected, even if there's an aesthetic movement behind craft, behind these things to be viable or interesting to us, that it has to be to some extent, or maybe it's not, but maybe what I'm saying is I think there is a relationship, even if it doesn't seem overt, maybe it's underscoring a relationship or a tension that exists that we're kind of going to be experiencing possibly over the next 10 years or sooner.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Craft implies utility usually, and use, and therefore maybe there's a link between craft and, I don't know, practices of care, or quilt, for instance, and keep us warm.
Yeah,
So,
possibly.
yeah.
I'll read the question.
I'm getting here a couple of other questions. One, I start with this. Sure. How do you feel about the future of biennials, major art exhibitions like Documenta within your arguments?
Yeah, I mean, I spoke about my experience in Documenta today, and I think there's a lot that can be said about the recent Documenta, and specifically the the kind of media response to this Documenta, and also the way that for instance, anti-Semitism appeared in that exhibition.
Yeah, the media, talking about media, that would be a whole other, yeah, okay.
But totally, I mean, I think I would just briefly say two things. I mean, one is that this was a really, we're talking about decentralization. This is an exhibition in which decentralization was very much enacted, almost as a program. There was no one in charge of everything. There were people who were just asked to do things, or asked to show, who were inviting others to show. So it was a kind of round robin, which was like a, kind of very, very horizontal approach to curating. The second is it showed that also kind of tragically, it showed that, you bring groups of different histories together, and there are going to be conflicts, and there's going to be, it's not going to be a pretty picture always, and this is what we observed with this Documenta, right? That, that there are, the aspiration to be global and representative. It's not necessarily a peaceful aspiration. This is what.
But it's about placemaking.
Yeah.
Does it continue differently? Now, this Documenta, speaking with visitor numbers, was the best visited Documenta I have heard. There is still a future.
I think just briefly, something else that I found quite interesting is that, I mentioned the Dana in my presentation today. I mentioned the Emmett Till painting by Dana Schutz, and which was really such a watermark in sort of historical and aesthetic consciousness, especially in the U.S. And what was interesting is that, that painting was shown in Berlin, and no one said anything.
I know.
Yeah. And in this, my point here is just that what can be so passionately questioned, or what can seem so important in one place might not always have the same urgency in somewhere else. And I find that resonated a little bit with what I observed in this Documenta, which is that there was a kind of renegotiation of German history that was occurring, and it maybe resonated outside of Germany in as the same way, or it didn't. And I guess what I could say is about this is that
I think it didn't, but that's a whole other discussion. So
that's interesting, that there's not a linear discursive field. There's that's quite strange. I think no one's been able to explain that really.
I agree. Hey, we have.
I'm going to read the one question in the Q&A before we move on. Is that okay? We have a question from Dawn. Dawn writes, I am a socially engaged artist living and working on unceded Oneida Nation land in rural central New York State. Assembling and co-creating with those locally and regionally in rural spaces, one must often collaborate with those that do not share similar political values, something that we know very well also here. Can you point to artists and collectives building new assemblies today that are using this agonism and antagonism as the material that must hold our work and sustain our lives? I can also repeat the question if.
No, I think I follow, yeah. I mean, I don't want to promote anyone in particular, but I have been following the collective Project Artworks, and they're a UK-based art collective of differently abled individuals. And as they put it, individuals with complex support needs. And I'm quite interested in how they are able to question notions of ability, when ability, for instance, is so entrenched in the way we think about beauty or art, and also that there's no to have a complex support need it might differ from person to person, and that's just it just seems like such a fragile and difficult project, and quite important to consider, what diversity looks like in practice. That's how I would, that's one group.
Micaela, can I?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, only closing with two other remarks from Zita Kopp. Luxury is all about narrative, so is contemporary art.
It's interesting. Can I say one thing? Considering like one of the on Fogo Island, very quickly to summarize, there's the Fogo Island woodshop workshops and the Orange Lodge, and I think one of the most salient actually connections between what Zita has just said, but what you were saying earlier about like branding, marketing, storytelling, is like the story of the puppy table by Nick Herder, which must be one of the best-selling pieces of furniture.
No one knows on the call.
Well, I mean, a few people will know, but it's all to say, one of the reasons I think that's one of the best-selling items is because it has like a really beautiful story behind it. Somebody who's been a part of this project for a long time. It has like, there's no material is like wasted in the making of this like side table, basically. We can send you what it looks like, Pablo, just for like a bit of context. But it's a bit of like a pointer to what you were saying. It's a real like negotiation or example on our level of that reality.
Okay, thank you very much all for joining, Pablo.
Thank you.
See you in a couple of minutes. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
The next Lost and Found Agency talk is going to be held at the end of November with Sophie Cal, and I'll send information around soon.
So the exact date?
I believe it's November 17th.
Yeah, so thank you. Thank you all.
Right. Bye.
Bye, thank you.